The date at which a document was created is often a core question when examining such documents. The date may speak to the authenticity of the document. Let us use two examples to illustrate the point. The one example that we will use is a suicide note. So a body is found, there is a suicide note, and the suicide note explains why the person decided to take his or her own life. Now, that can be an authentic description written by the person, but it can also be a part of a foul play. It can be a case where that person was actually murdered and someone then wrote the suicide note after the fact. The second example that we're going to use is also associated with death. The last will and testament of a person often requires certain formalities. But at least in South Africa, the courts have waived some of those formalities if they deemed it appropriate. And therefore, you may find a last will and testament that was written 30, 40 years ago. And that's the only copy of that document that exists. And therefore, that is the latest such document, and you want to use that. If the official requirements bother you, the need for witnesses to have signed it and so on, think about a living will. A living will does not need all the same legal requirements, but the living will says how you want to be treated if you are critically ill. For example, you may say that I do not want to be resuscitated under the following conditions. So such a document may also have been written a week ago, or it may have been written 30 years ago. When we are talking about death, then suddenly people may want to inherit money now, and foul play may be involved. So the authenticity of those documents are of critical importance. In the case of physical documents, physical document examiners have developed a range of techniques that are used to determine the age of a document. The techniques include looking at the age of the ink that was used to produce the document, to write it or to print it. It includes looking at the age of the paper on which this document was written, was printed. It includes the handwriting, because if the handwriting can be associated with a person who lived at a certain time, then we can conclude that that person wrote the document, and we have determined the age of the document within a certain time period. And this is one of the challenges we're going to face when we talk about date and time, is can we narrow it down to a precise date and time, or can we only talk about an era? And sometimes an era is the best we can do, and in some cases the precise date and time is of critical importance. The suicide note that is found was probably written just before the suicide. If the person committed suicide today, the note may have been written earlier today or yesterday, and we want to know whether it was written in the morning or the afternoon, because in the afternoon it means someone else have written it. So in the case of a last will and testament, where the document may be 30, 40 years old, or a living will where the document may be 30 years old again, an era may be adequate. It's not someone who suddenly decided, I want to get rid of this person, and while I'm getting rid of this person, I'm creating a new last will and testament, or I am creating a new living will so that this person definitely will not be resuscitated, and I stand to inherit a lot of money. So precise time and date sometimes, or an era in other cases. The techniques that I've mentioned that are used by physical document examiners is not nearly exhaustive. That's a whole subject field on its own, and I'm not going to elaborate on those techniques because that is outside the scope of my expertise. What we have to do is we have to consider how we can determine the age of a document or the date on which it was produced in a digital context. And what we will do is to use a schema that consists of 4 components. First of these components is metadata. As we've seen, metadata do often tell us when a document was created. We know that it's easy to change, but we've also seen that it may not be that easy in many cases because of different fields of metadata that are interrelated, that either replicate the same value or that are statistically dependent on other values. So metadata may be a very good starting point, but we may have a document that doesn't have rich metadata, and therefore we have a challenge. The second category that we are going to look at is the medium on which the document exists. We know that different media have been used over time. Many years ago, floppy disks were the only media available to us. More recently, SSD has become a very, very popular medium. Now, if we find the document on an older type of medium, then we may be able to say something about the age of the document. More specifically, we can say that the document existed during the era in which that medium was used. It's a fuzzy determination, but we can nonetheless do that. The third category that we will look at is the tool that was used to create it. The tool, or even the version of the tool, also has a certain period during which it is prevalent. And if that tool was used to create the document, we can use the prevalence of the tool to determine the likely time period, the likely era during which the document was created. And then finally, the content or the formatting of the document may tell us a lot about the age of the document. When I talk about the content, I'm not talking about the message contained in the document necessarily. I am talking about aspects that we may find in the content that did not exist at some earlier time. And to give it away a little bit, one of the aspects that we will be looking at is emojis, because emojis have only been in use for a rather short time in the history of computing, and if you find the wrong emoji in a document, it may tell us that the document has been altered or that it is a fabricated document, that it is a forgery. Let's start with the first item on our agenda. The first item on this schema that we are using is metadata. As we've noted a moment or two ago, metadata often tells us exactly when a document was created. We also said that it is rather easy to modify metadata, but in the previous video we saw that there are various aspects that may make it harder than one would think. Whether that is true or not depends to a large extent on the type of document we are talking about. Some documents may have a very simple date and time in their metadata, and it may be very, very easy to modify it without leaving any traces. Other documents, especially more recent document formats, often contain a plethora of metadata, and we have to ensure that fields that are repeated or that are statistically dependent on other fields remain consistent. And that makes life a lot harder. So whether we are going to trust the metadata depends on the type of metadata, the amount of redundancy in that metadata, and arguably also on the availability of tools to modify such metadata in a way that cannot be perceived, or on the technical skills of a possible suspect. So metadata may be really valuable, but it depends on a number of aspects. And we, in many cases, will want to confirm that the metadata is correct. Therefore, we will move on to the second category on our schema, that of the medium on which a document exists. The medium on which a document exists may be because that is where the document has been found. It is on that particular medium. Or it may be a backup that was made of a person's disk and therefore it was copied onto that medium. Very often backups are stored on removable media, and what we ideally need is to be able to look at those backup media. Whether we have the authority depends on search warrants and so on. We assume at this point that we do have the authority, and in particular we have the ability to look through the backups that the person has made to determine whether a document existed at some prior time. In our example of the suicide note, this may not be very useful, but in the case of our living will or our last will and testament that was purportedly written a few decades ago, it may indeed be very useful. So let's look at the media that were used for backup purposes, but in some cases were also used as the primary disk on a computer. First example is a 5¼ floppy disk. These 5¼ floppy disks were used in the 1980s and a little bit beyond to store data. Initially, when the IBM personal computer was introduced, these were the primary storage medium. Hard disks were expensive. They didn't exist. But over time, hard disks were installed in computers, and these became mostly mechanisms to either make backups or carry our data from one computer to another computer. These disks could store 160 kilobytes in the early days, single-side floppy disks, and went up to somewhat larger capacities, 1.2 megabytes in later incarnations. The floppy disks that I have available at this stage are mostly unreadable. When I put them in the disk drive, I often am able to see a directory, but I am no longer able to read the content of the disks. These disks have forgotten that was stored on them. However, even a table of contents may be useful to say whether a document existed in this time era. So in the case of our last will and testament or our living will, which was written perhaps in the 1980s, if we can find the person's backup floppies and we are able to look at them, then we may be able to confirm that this document did in fact exist back in the days, in the era during which these floppy disks were used. Prior to the use of the 5¼ floppy disks, the 8 floppy disks were used. Not too many people use them, but they also still exist. My assumption is that most of them have lost the data that they contain, but I am not in a position to read those myself any longer, so I don't know what data is available on the ones that I have access to. The 5¼ disks were later on replaced by what is known in South Africa as a stiffy. Stiffy disk, obviously, because it is stiff when compared to a floppy disk. In most other parts of the world, there is still known as a floppy disk, a 3.5-inch floppy disk, and it could store 1.44 megabytes of information. There are many people who can still read and write these disks, but they are disappearing from new computers. So it's only a matter of time before we are unable to read them on general purpose machines. And one of the questions that arises is whether a person has the ability to write to such a disk. Think about the last will and testament again. If we find a copy of that on such a stiffy disk, then we are able to say that this existed in the time of stiffy disks, which may be a time that continues up to this day. But if there is nobody associated with that person who wrote this last will and testament, who has the ability to write to such a disk, then it may be possible to infer that it was written at an earlier time, at an earlier date, and therefore existed some time ago at least. Now, the conclusion or the input that nobody associated with this person had the ability to write to such a disk is a hard thing to prove. So I'm not going to emphasize that too much. But if we are in such a position, then we may be able to say this did exist, especially if there is a suspect in the case who may have forged the last will and testament. Then we can ask the question whether that person had the ability to write to such a disk. Again, hard to answer, but if it's possible to answer it, then we have grounds to say that this document existed some time ago. At the very least, it existed prior to the person's death. The limited capacity of the diskettes that we've just been talking about led to the development of a range of alternative solutions. This is a floptical disk, so it uses magnetic floppy technology, but it also uses laser guidance to precisely position the read-write head. Capacity of this disk was 120 megabytes compared to the 1.44 megabytes of an ordinary stiffy. If you compare the two, then you'll see that they are the same size. And the disk drives that we use to write to these disks could in fact also read ordinary stiffy disks. It's been a while since disk drives have been manufactured for these floptical drives, and many of the drives that were in use failed over time. So it becomes rather unlikely that a person would be able to write something to such a disk. Unlikely, but not impossible. But what it does mean is we as document examiners need the ability to look on such a disk to see whether a copy does exist on such a disk. And if we find the copy on such a disk, then it again limits the window during which that document was created. In all likelihood, it is an indication that the document existed some time ago. And as time goes by, it becomes less and less likely that a forger will be able to create a document and put it on such a medium. Yet another development in the attempt to create bigger disks was the zip disk. The zip disk, in its ordinary incarnation, could store 100 megabytes. This is the later model, somewhat scarcer. This can store 250 megabytes on the disk. This did not attempt to be compatible with floppy disks at all, so you can see that there are size differences. Don't know if it's visible, but also differences in the thickness of the devices. The same happened to these devices. They are no longer manufactured. It's rather hard to get one of them. Many devices have failed over the years. Many devices also use interfaces that have become rather scarce. So, yet again, it's not impossible that a forger will be able to create a document on such a disk, but it is unlikely. So if we go through the backup disks that we found where the person who wrote his last will and testament kept his backups, then we should be able, if we find such a document, if we find such a disk, and we find the document on this disk, then it corroborates the point that this document was written long ago at the time at which it was dated, most probably. For backup purposes, tape drives were also used. They were less common than the other media that I've spoken about, but the same applies. It has become virtually impossible to find tape drives to read and write these tapes. Virtually impossible, so not totally impossible, but it is hard for a forger to find such a device, create backups on it, create backups that look authentic, because in context, if you have a lot of new documents on it, then it doesn't look authentic. So you need backups of a bunch of old documents, probably of old software on it, to make it all appear realistic. That's hard for a forger to do. If we find a copy of this document that is purportedly 20, 30, 40 years old, and we find the copy on a disk like this, then we can conclude that it existed at that time, unless we are dealing with a particularly proficient forger. More recently, CDs and DVDs, especially the writable types or the read-writable types, have been used for backup purposes. These are also becoming scarcer. They're still available on a lot of machines, so we cannot say that the era of CDs and DVDs is over in the sense that they are no longer used. But the prevalence of their use has definitely declined. Many new computers are unable to read from such disks or write to such disks. Yes, you can do so easily with an external writer, but the same applies that we said earlier. If the suspect does not have access to such a reader or writer, it is less likely that the suspect would have been able to write documents to such a disk, and that makes it somewhat less likely that the document has been forged. However, with this one, we have to be even more cautious than with the other examples that we've mentioned, because it is still fairly easy to find a writer that is capable of writing to such disks. We should also keep in mind that if this document that we are examining was ever printed out, and we have those printouts, then it also falls into the category of a physical document. And the age of the paper, the age of the ink, whether it's toner or pigment or whatever type of printer was used that deposited the ink on the page, those aspects are within the realm that a physical document examiner can examine. And they may be able to say that this printout is 10 years old, 20 years old, whatever the case may be. One of the nice things with ink, especially in inkjet printers, is that they also tend to be replaced from one model to another model, and an ink cartridge quickly becomes old. In fact, a lot of printers will prevent you from using an old cartridge because it has the date, the expiry date, imprinted on that in the digital data on that cartridge, so that it will not allow you to use an old ink cartridge. So if you do find ink from a given period, it again places the document in that period. So physical document analysis, if there is a physical copy available, is certainly valuable, may even be more valuable than the digital analysis that we are talking about. Let us now talk about the tool that was used to create the document. Over the years, many tools have been used to create documents. My first true personal computer came with a copy of WordStar. WordStar was a word processor that was the most popular word processor from around 1980 up to the point at which it was most popular, around 1985. And then it started to decline over the next couple of years, became less and less popular. At this point, I am, for example, no longer able to read the digital copy of my master's dissertation because I wrote it in WordStar. One does get tools in modern word processors to read WordStar files, but they don't quite work. I use some slightly advanced features of WordStar, not even extremely advanced, and those fool the word processors at the moment. Whether those plugins are able to write WordStar files is another question. So if one finds a WordStar file, a file that was written by WordStar, it was probably written in the period from more or less 1980 to more or less 1990, somewhere in that window. Again, it's a long-tailed window. People may have used WordStar after that. And in principle, it is possible to get a copy of WordStar now, install it on a personal computer, and run it and produce WordStar files. However, many of these old programs are no longer compatible with modern operating systems and modern hardware. In fact, the installation media may not be readable. My WordStar came on floppy disks, 5.25-inch floppy disks, so it's unlikely that the copies that I still have will be able to run. However, that doesn't mean it's not available. It simply means it is a challenge, and because it's a challenge, we have to look at the abilities of the suspect to determine whether the suspect would have been able to write such an old file. WordStar was more or less replaced by WordPerfect, and for the next couple of years, WordPerfect was the dominant force in word processing. At some time, Microsoft Word became more popular, and businesses had the choice. So most businesses standardized the word processor that they were using so that they could send a document from one person in the organization to another person. And many businesses standardized on WordPerfect, and other businesses standardized on Microsoft Word. And these two coexisted for a long time in businesses. And therefore, WordPerfect files are fairly likely to be found. Many documents, especially if it was written on a work computer, and during those times that we're talking about a few decades ago, people didn't necessarily have a home computer, so many would have written a document at the office. And if their office used WordPerfect, in all likelihood, they would have written the document in WordPerfect. So if we find the document now written in WordPerfect, it may be perfectly consistent with what we expected. And the question arises, if we think that the document is forged, whether the person who forged it, whether the suspect had the ability to create a WordPerfect file. In this history of word processors, we know that certain tools seem to have won the game. However, the fight is still ongoing. And with Google Docs as one example, especially while it is free, the question does arise why people are using tools that cost a fair amount of money. Also with LibreOffice, the question does arise, it being free, why do people not use it? Why do they prefer to pay a lot of money or use an illegal copy of a tool? So time may change and we may see these tools becoming more and more popular, these alternative tools becoming more and more popular. And we may also see that something like Microsoft Word declines in popularity. Another category of tools demonstrates how the perceived prevalence of tools changed over the years. What we are looking at right now is a comparison of software to create what they called business-like slideshows. This was published in Byte magazine in February 1997. 23 years before this recording was made. The contenders that they consider in this review are Corel Presentation 7.0, Adobe Persuasion 3.0.2, Lotus Freelance Graphics 96, Harvard Graphics 4.0, and Microsoft PowerPoint 95, which happens to be version 7.0. After reviewing the capabilities of each of these software packages, they reach the conclusion that Corel Presentation is the winner of this shootout and the one that they can recommend. Most viewers of this particular video will not even recognize most of the names that have been mentioned as contenders in this particular review. It is hard to think about the various software packages that once upon a time were popular and were used to create documents. And we should not just assume that because a tool is a de facto standard right now, it was the de facto standard some time ago. In the current time, in the current climate, presumably PowerPoint is deemed to be the de facto standard. But we've seen tools like Prezi that are fighting for their space in this arena. We know that PowerPoint also has negative connotations, such as the popular phrase, death by PowerPoint. And we don't even know how the tools that are currently provided, again, free of charge by places like Google for presentations, will impact on the continued popularity of PowerPoint. What this means is that the tools that currently seem to be the standard go-to tool 30, 20, 10 years ago was not the standard tool to go to. And that makes a difference. That means that we should expect a variety of document formats to have been used, a variety of tools to have been used in days gone by. So especially if we want to conclude that a document is somewhat older, as is the case with this will, where it purportedly was written a few decades ago, we should expect it to be written in some obscure word processor, or maybe an early incarnation of a current word processor. One of the changes that has also obviously come about with modern tools is that many of the modern tools automatically create backups in the cloud. So if someone wants to forge a document, they may be leaving traces in the cloud. and where we had previously spoken about recovering backups from media that has become obscure, we may now be able to recover a backup from the cloud. And that cloud backup may be dated. There may be a log of when it was written, and that may again enable us to date the document to a rather specific date and time. In both the medium and the tool category, I said that our finding may depend on the abilities of the suspect. Obviously, using common sense, that is true. If someone wants to recreate a document that is 30 years old, then that someone may consider it necessary to create the document on an appropriate backup medium, and the person may have to find such a medium and go to a fair amount of trouble to create such a backup disk. Similarly, if the suspect is indeed guilty and the suspect wanted to create a document using the appropriate word processing software, then the suspect would have to get such a word processor up and running, and that is not trivial. So we are talking about someone who has more than the normal amount of skill. However, it may just be someone who is lucky and has an old machine standing in a corner that hasn't been used for 30 years. And turning that machine on simply provides the person with all the necessary tools to recreate this almost ancient document. The challenge is that we are not psychologists. We cannot make any pronouncements on the cognitive abilities that are required, or the technical skills that are required from a person to either recreate a backup disk or to create a document using an appropriate word processing tool. We can merely state that doing that is unusual. It usually takes a large amount of effort to recreate such a document in a realistic manner, to recreate backups in a realistic manner, and so on. In the end, it is up to the court to decide whether this person had the opportunity or the ability to recreate such forgeries, and they will probably listen to experts in the field of psychology if necessary. Our role stops at the point where we can say that this medium, this type of word processor, this file type, is no longer in use and cannot be created easily without the appropriate access to such tools or without the technical knowledge about doing it. We have to stay within the limits of our field of expertise. We now move to the fourth and final category of our discussion, the one that we initially said would take up most of the time of our discussion. And here we are talking about the format of the document and or the content of the document. Remember that we said that we are not particularly interested in the content of the document in terms of its actual content, in terms of the words that are used. We are more interested in the technical content of the document, things like emojis. We are also more interested in the format, the structure of the document, because that enables us to date the document more precisely. We have mentioned emojis as an example of the type of content that we will talk about under the heading Content and Format. When emojis were first introduced around the turn of the century, they were not standardized. And when you sent someone else an emoji, that emoji would probably have been rendered as something totally different or as an empty rectangle on the recipient's cell phone. Emojis have spread from cell phones. It's used all over the place. It's used in emails. It's used in various internet message formats. And it has become part of our document landscape. The problem with non-standard emojis was solved by including emojis as Unicode characters. So from about 2005, the Unicode standard standardized these emojis, and that meant that everybody was using the same set of emojis. Every year, when the Unicode standard is updated, new emojis are added as required. As an example, the emoji that represents a microbe was added to Unicode in the year 2018. This emoji obviously became very popular during the COVID pandemic in 2020, and one sees it in so many messages nowadays. However, the point is that prior to 2018, this emoji did not exist, and one couldn't have included it. So if you find a document that predates 2018 and it includes the microbe emoji, a good source for information about emojis is Emojipedia. One of the entries on Emojipedia that is interesting right now is the list of emojis that have been approved for inclusion in Unicode in 2021. The list was clearly influenced by current events, with a number of aspects that people may want to include in messages right now. However, note that the way that these emojis are displayed on Emojipedia is not necessarily the way in which they will be displayed on actual devices. We will look at some of the earlier lists of emojis that have been included in Unicode over the years, and we will also look at how some of those emojis are rendered on different devices. In particular, will we look at some emojis that have been rendered differently over the years on some devices. The rendering is not particularly important for us because we are not seeing the output of a device in the digital world. We are looking at the digital contents. So the availability of these emojis is more important. The fact that you know which code point is used in Unicode for a particular emoji is important. So one of the things that we can do with this new list of emojis is to already see what the code points are, and we can start using them now. So even though they will only be rendered properly in 2021, we can begin to include them in documents right now if we really want to. But prior to this, it would have been meaningless to include them because a particular code point, even though you could have used that code point, could have been assigned to anything. And therefore, the emoji would not fit the contents of the message. There would have been a discrepancy. Hence, you should be careful to think about an emoji's availability. As an example, the emoji for a man with a beard is one that will be included in 2021. We know what its code point is right now, so we can in principle include it. It wouldn't quite make sense, but we can include it if we really want to. It will not be rendered properly, but on next year's devices or after software updates of current devices, it will be rendered appropriately. However, before this announcement was made about the emojis that would be included for 2021, the code points were not known, and it was not possible to predict which would be assigned to any given set. If we look at the emojis that are considered for 2022, then we do not even know whether those are really the emojis that will be assigned in 2022 or that will be included in 2022. And we do not know what code points will be used for any given emoji, if it is included. Emojis is just one category of changes that are annually made to Unicode. As another example, the new Indian rupee symbol was introduced in 2010. It's unlikely that it will affect too many documents in other countries, but clearly it will have a major impact on the documents that originate from India. One can see on the unicode.org website that in 2020, 5,930 new Unicode characters were added. Most of those characters are for languages that most of us have probably never heard of, but a new copyright symbol for Creative Commons has been added, and a couple of block graphics for old IBM PC games, more specifically those blocks that were used for teletext communication, have also been added in 2020. Every year this grows significantly, and every year there is probably something in there that one may encounter fairly regularly in everyday documents. The strategy that one can follow is to consider any document that is being examined to see whether it includes Unicode characters, either in the document itself as part of the text or in the metadata. And then one can find the most recent Unicode characters that have been used in that text, and one knows that the document was created after those characters were introduced. The various encoding formats, UTF-8, UTF-16 and so on, also are associated with dates at which they became available, and one can use those dates also as a starting point. The document had to have been created after that starting point. Unicode is not the only encoding mechanism, though. There are many other encoding mechanisms, and for those one can also consider the dates at which they were introduced and use that as a starting point, as an earliest creation date for the document, or, where appropriate, the earliest date at which the document was modified to its current form. Looking at the larger structure of a document, a common format is often used to encode the content of a document. I'm thinking here about a document that is encoded, say, in HTML. And HTML has evolved over the years. We have seen the various standards that have been developed right through the series up to the point we have HTML5 at the moment. We also have individual histories of some of the tags. Prior to standardization, many browsers included some tags or supported some tags that were not standard, and those were used for a while and then either incorporated into a standard or assumed to be a default standard, or some have been dropped. But the presence of such tags in an HTML document tells us typically something about the version of the HTML document, and the version was standardized at a given point, and hence we can find this earliest creation date for a document if we look at the HTML in which it was encoded. Similar remarks apply to many other formats that have versions. One of the proprietary examples, Microsoft Documents, used the .doc and the .ppt and whatever other extensions that were used, and then they changed to the docx format. And similarly for the other Office products, they added an X to the end of that note. Those files, the ones with the X's, are very, very different from the original versions or the original representations that were used. If you were to open those files on a low level, you will see that they are actually zipped files that contain a number of internal files, amongst them files that exist in XML. So from the mere fact that .docx was used, we can conclude that this document was created after the .docx format was adopted. However, we can also examine the internal components and based on that find that a document, because of the format that it includes in one of its constituent files, points us to a given earliest creation date. In many cases, the media type of a document is included in the document's metadata. One of the places where one sees that often is in an email header or an header that is received from an HTTP server, but it is used in many, many more places. Those media types, or as they used to be known, MIME types, are also evolving, and more types are added annually. And in the same manner that we've used the other document types, we can look at a given media type and subtype, and based on the introduction date of that type and subtype, we may be able to find an earliest creation date for a document. By way of example, let us look at the media types as they are defined on the ihana.org website. You can see that this is a recent update. Media types are what they're now known as, and they used to be known as MIME types. So in a couple of cases, notably email headers and so on, but also in many other cases, the MIME type will be specified explicitly, or the media type then. There are the well-known registries that are supported, and what we can do is to click on text, because that is arguably an example of something that we will encounter as a message, a text document. So there's a long list of text documents that are supported. Let's go to one of the early ones, and let's go to the calendar. Very often when I click on this link, it provides me with more information. It tells me when it was introduced in a number of cases. In this case, unfortunately, it does not, and therefore I have to go to the RFC itself. The RFC is 5545, so let's look at that RFC. And in that standard, you can see a date, September 2009, but be careful, this is an update of an earlier standard. And the earlier standard was dated November 1998. And if one scrolls through this, then you can see that this memo is indeed formatted as a registration for a MIME media type, as prescribed by the relevant standard. And they are prescribing the text.calendar subtype. There is nothing that precedes this, so there is indeed an update to this standard, nothing that precedes this, so the iCalendar entry as a MIME type, in particular text/calendar, did not exist, was not defined before November 1998. And if we were to find this media type in any particular document, we know that the earliest creation date for such a document could have been November 1998. It is possible to consider a host of other components and formats that help to create a document. Think, for example, about the use of codecs in audio and in video files. In general, file formats have evolved over the years. So from all of those components and from the formats, we should be able to establish an earliest creation date. What we've seen from the work discussed earlier in the video, we were able to narrow the creation or the modification of a file down to an era, to a fuzzy period during which storage media of a certain type were used, or during which a specific application program was used. In both cases, we were interested in the general era during which that medium was used, also the general era in which that program, that software that created the document, was used. However, we noted that it is more important to consider the fact whether the person who could have forged such a document had access to equipment to later have created such a document. In any case, we can correlate that creation era, that fuzzy period, with the creation date that is specified in the metadata. And if the two are consistent, then we have a pretty good indication of when this document was created.